Alright, so now that it's New Year's, do y'all remember that article that came out on Halloween that talked about why it's offensive to dress up like a witch? 'Cause I do. And it's kinda bullshit. Hey friends, welcome back to Snark Notes. This is the first dual video/podcast episode I'm doing, and I'm pretty excited about it, so thanks for joining me. Okay, last video we discussed the link between witchcraft, witch hunts, and the establishment of capitalism. Today we're going to be building on that, because for us to be able to deconstruct this article, which is called The Problem with Dressing Up as a Witch for Halloween by Markham-Cantor, it's crucial to understand that the persecution of witches is inherently tied to capitalist hegemony. It's something this article touches on, but doesn't really seem to fully articulate. So, yeah, since the European witch hunts, women who threatened the gendered hierarchy that capitalism necessitates have been persecuted and murdered to maintain that hierarchy. It's not because they dressed in black robes and pointy hats. The first thing I want to address is actually Markham-Cantor's first point. Quote, "It is a privilege to pretend to be a witch and not die."
Bruh.
I think something we can clearly see, particularly from reading Caliban and the Witch, or even Re-enchanting the Commons, also by Silvia Federici, nobody who was murdered in the witch hunts, whether in Europe or in colonized countries today, was really killed for looking like a witch. Sure, the male authorities of the 15th through the 17th century in Europe pigeonholed the victims for looking a certain way, like being an old woman, or having satanic marks like warts and stuff, or embodying anti-Semitic tropes. But doing that was a tactic for those empowered to dehumanize women and Jewish people. Like, let's take a minute to discuss how the accused were checked for the devil's mark. And content warning here for sexual assault and graphic abuse. In Caliban, Federici writes,
"According to the standard procedure, the accused were stripped naked and completely shaved. It was argued that the devil hid among their hair. Then they were pricked with long needles all over their bodies, including their vaginas, in search for the mark with which the devil presumably branded his creatures. Often they were raped. It was investigated whether or not they were virgins, a sign of innocence, and if they did not confess, they were submitted to even more atrocious ordeals. Their limbs were torn, they were seated on iron chairs under which fires were lit, their bones were crushed, and when they were hung or burnt, care was taken so that the lesson to be drawn from their end would not go unheeded."
Federici goes on to add that in the spectacle of a witch burning, daughters were whipped and forced to watch their mothers die. So, on the whole, pretty dehumanizing. It's almost like singling out women for having certain totally normal blemishes was a pretense for powerful men to assault largely poor women and brutally exert control over them, to break them, and any solidarity that they had in their communities. We also need to talk about how the women accused of witchcraft were often elderly. Here's quite the quote from the philosopher Erasmus.
Yet it is even more fun to see the old women who can scarcely carry their weight of years and look like corpses that seem to have risen from the dead. They still go around saying, life is good, still in heat, looking for a mate. They are forever smearing their faces with makeup and taking tweezers to their pubic hair, exposing their sagging, withered breasts, and trying to rouse failing desire with their quavering, whining voices, while they drink, dance among girls, and scribble their love letters.
Federici responds, quote, "In the iconography of the witch hunt, old age precludes in women the possibility of sexual life, contaminates it, turns sexual activity into a tool of death rather than a means of regeneration." She proposes, too, that the iconography of the witch's broomstick was linked to sexual expression, because broomsticks are phallic, and seeing older women holding anything that looked vaguely like a dick made people retch because, oh no, what if these old hags are feeling turned on and having sex? Don't enjoy your body. And there's more to the disgust of elderly women as it pertains to the European witch hunts. Federici explains, quote, "In England, the witches were usually old women on public assistance or women who survived by going from house to house begging for bits of food or a pot of wine or milk." She relays the story of Margaret Harket, an old widow of 65 hanged in 1585.
She had picked a basket of peas in the neighbor's field without permission. Asked to return them, she flung them down in anger. Since then, no peas would grow in the field. Later, William Goodwin's servant denied her yeast, whereupon his brewing stand dried up. She was struck by a bailiff who had caught her taking wood from the master's ground. The bailiff went mad. A neighbor refused her a horse. All his horses died. A gentleman told his servant to refuse her buttermilk, after which they were unable to make butter or cheese.
Federici lists a handful of other English women hanged or otherwise murdered for daring to ask their neighbors for foodstuffs, and, when denied, those women were alleged to have punished those neighbors or their families. And asking for food wasn't the only action that could get you killed for witchcraft. It was asking for money, or being unable to pay rent, or grazing cattle on land that didn't belong to you, or practicing rituals like incantations or carrying amulets, which were usually practiced by poor people who struggled to survive. Magic was one of the few means laborers and the poor still had at their disposal at this point, because they sure didn't have land and other resources they needed to reproduce themselves. So magic bolstered them, their health, their family's health, their general well-being, and their ability to preserve what autonomy they had left. But the new capitalist class had to crush this means of resistance because it kept the peasants from being productive. And of course, this came down hardest on women because, as Federici explains, quote, even when they were not expert sorcerers/magicians, they were the ones who were called to mark animals when they fell sick, heal their neighbors, help them find lost or stolen objects, give them amulets or love potions, help them forecast the future. The work these women did stood in direct opposition to the goals of the capitalist ruling class, who wanted to divide and conquer laborers in order to make them easier to manipulate, to wring out all valuable labor for as little as they could, to make the working class lose hope. All of this is to say, the people who have perished in early modern and modern-day witch hunts weren't really killed for being witches. Victims might not have even called themselves witches. Instead, the ruling class has consistently used existing misogyny as a weapon to divide the working class and whip up fear to guarantee submission and access to common land. The rich need hard-working laborers to disavow the laborers that don't work hard enough because they'd rather steal baskets of beans and mooch off their landlords, and that's bad for profits. So honestly, I think to say something like, it's a privilege to dress up like a witch and not die is overly simplistic, to put it nicely. That statement ignores the very real material conditions that have gotten people murdered in order to do some high-horse moralizing about privilege. Let me be clear here. Acknowledging privilege is a healthy and necessary thing to do in order to recognize how we benefit or suffer from various forms of systemic oppression. But the act of dressing like a witch isn't really connected with those material conditions that we've been talking about, because our conception of the image of the witch has changed over time and across regions. So to act as if Halloween costumes are linked with the material conditions surrounding the witch hunts is a huge disservice to the victims of the witch hunts and their legacy of suffering under the brutal implementation and maintenance of our current economic system. And I think what kills me the most about this article's argument is that Markham-Cantor straight up says, quote, it's true that the people who were killed for witchcraft today are not killed for dressing up in a costume. They are killed because of intersecting economic, political, and social factors. She kind of performatively states that the stereotypical depiction of the witch and the actual victims of the witch hunts aren't necessarily related, and then keeps arguing as if they are. But as I said, our characterization of the witch has evolved over time, and as we've seen so far, even the late medieval witches weren't killed for dressing up in a costume. In her article, Why Do Witches Wear Pointy Hats?, Katy Waldman writes, medieval depictions of witches often show them nude and bareheaded, their long hair mingling with flames and smoke. Woodcuts from the 1600s occasionally outfitted spellcasters in common bonnets. It wasn't until the 1710s and 1720s that children's chapbooks in England began illustrating supernatural tales with crones and peaked hats. Fueled by the popularity of these penny merriments, the stereotype caught on quickly. Western European artists began to modify images of witches from the Middle Ages, lengthening the blunt tips of their caps into devilish spikes. According to Gary Jensen, a former professor at Vanderbilt and author of The Path of the Devil, Early Modern Witch Hunts, the pointed cap became an easy, evocative way to signal dark magic. Witches in peaked hats started to appear on postcards from the American colonies. Legendary figures like Mother Goose and La Befana acquired pointy hats. Later, Victorian-era storybooks further developed this theme. Dr. Christina Wade corroborates this in her article, Nope, Medieval Alewives Aren't the Archetype for the Modern Pop Culture Witch. She writes, quote, the introduction of the pointy hat-clad witch seems to have surfaced in the 18th century in children's chapbooks, a pamphlet of tales. Of course, there is still debate about the origins of the pointed hat, the broomstick, and the animal iconography used to depict witches. But it's pretty clear that the archetype of the witch, as Markham-Cantor calls it, has not been a static image for the past 500-600 years. Here's a very benign comparison that I feel is kind of maybe a little apt. 1920s fashion. We all think it's short dresses and heavy dark makeup and big sex appeal. But that's a misconception. The dresses still covered the knees and the makeup was just a little heavier than a natural kind of fresh-faced look. But over time, the stereotypical 20s fashion image has been adapted and changed. It's been made a stereotype. And so has the costume of the witch. I do think stereotype is a better fit for the phenomenon that Markham-Cantor is discussing here, specifically because the image of the witch has evolved and been simplified into an old hag wearing a black hat and riding a broomstick. That image is arguably oversimplified, and it has become a convention. It has carried a lot of negative associations throughout modern history, culminating in the Disney Witch and the Wicked Witch of the West. Going off of negative associations, there's an important caveat here, which Markham-Cantor brings up. The witch's big hooked nose was most likely formed by anti-Semitic tropes, and the pointed hats potentially were as well. Waldman writes, in his book, Gary Jensen describes how the 1215 Fourth Council of the Lateran required all Jews to identify themselves by wearing the Juden hat, Jewish hat or horned skull cap. The style soon became a target for anti-Semitism. Artists painted devils muttering curses beneath Jewish crowns. In 1431, Hungarian legal codes required first-time sorcery offenders to walk among their peers in peaked Jews' caps. Medieval representations tying Jews to Satan were nothing new, and by the late 13th century, Jewish attributes had soaked up enough ugly significance to tar all unbelievers, hypocrites, heretics, pagans, and demons, Jensen writes. Similarly, Wade cites Peter Burke, who postulated in his Eyewitnessing the use of images as historical evidence that the witch's hat, and indeed the portrayal of the witch with the hooked nose, stemmed from virulent anti-Semitism. He described the portrayal of the witch as absorbing and amalgamating with contemporary depictions of Jewish people as the migration of stereotypes. Burke cited a decree of Buda, Hungary from 1421, declaring that all those arrested for sorcery must wear tall, pointed hats, and in early modern Spain, heretics were also required to wear similar garb. He referred to this as the visual code expressive of subhumanity. So yes, we should definitely keep in mind the rampant anti-Semitism of the late medieval, early modern period, and how that could have shaped the image of the witch. But on the bright side, both Waldman and Wade spend some time talking about the popularity and the sheer variety of hats of this period. So fingers crossed that was a bigger influence on the stereotype of the witch. Hopefully. But that does not negate the very real link that the ruling class forged between the Jews and the people persecuted as witches. Okay, so let's circle back to the image of the witch and how that fits into our contemporary discourse. We talked earlier about how the witch has become a stereotype, carrying a lot of negative baggage, particularly in association with evil old women. But I'm wondering if media from the latter half of the 20th century, particularly where the Addams Family and Elvira are concerned, had any measurable impact on the reclaiming of the witch. Because Morticia and Elvira are fun and funny, and young and attractive. They buck the expectations that formed the stereotypical witch, portraying witchy people as cool and admirable. Now this is total speculation on my part, but if you have thoughts or data to back me up, I'd love to hear it. Regardless, the image of the witch has been reclaimed. I think thankfully it's been largely divorced from the ageist and anti-Semitic tropes that helped give rise to it. There's a transgressive, empowering feeling that comes with identifying with that image now. And personally, I think that's pretty cool. We have positive depictions of witches today, and people are free to take up witchcraft and Wicca and other pagan practices. To that end, the witch has been reclaimed in a way that offensive costumes never can be. I mean, the first thought I had reading this article, the first thought a lot of people probably had reading this article, was how it's framed in such a way that mirrors the discussion of cultural appropriation in Halloween costumes. I'm like, come on, dressing up like a witch is clearly not in the same ballpark as dressing up in a stereotypical Native American costume or wearing something like blackface. And Markham-Cantor doesn't compare dressing as a witch to anything like that, but I think in trying to even suggest that witch costumes are a potential parallel to that discussion is, well, very white feminist. Yes, the image of the witch is connected to the slaughter of thousands of poor and elderly women and, let's be real, non-conforming folks. Obviously, I think it's critical that we understand that. But the witch as a character, an image, an archetype does not reflect the same legacy of ongoing colonialism and erasure that culturally appropriated costumes do. And as we've seen, the punishment and subordination of people through the witch hunts didn't happen because these people were actually witches, but Indigenous and Black people have been punished for being Indigenous and Black. It's a completely different dynamic, especially considering how white people have weaponized Indigenous dress and blackface as a way to further oppress people of color. I just don't think it's possible to weaponize a witch costume like that. That circles us back nicely to today's witch hunts, which, again, Markham-Cantor points out are linked to intersecting economic, political, and social factors, specifically colonialism, gender hierarchy, economic inequality, and Christianity. She does miss one vital thing, though, which connects all of these factors together. Capitalism. Yeah, we're at that point. Early mercantile capitalism was the impetus for the European witch hunts, and its preservation requires many of the same tactics that it did in the late 15th century. That includes the implementation of wage dependency, a renewed focus on exporting goods, privatization of services, privatization of land, forcing people to migrate to find work, and severely undercutting communal ties. Federici discusses all of these issues at length in her book Re-enchanting the Commons. About enclosures in particular, she writes, quote, "The enclosures are a common denominator of proletarian experience across the globe. In the biggest diaspora of the century, on every continent, millions are uprooted from their land, their jobs, their homes, through wars, famines, plagues, and IMF-ordered devaluations." And of course, African, South American, and Southern Asian nations bear a large brunt of this phenomenon. It's an ongoing result of colonization and imperialism. Neoliberal policies, enforced by the IMF and the World Bank, have wrecked the solidarity of communities, forcing them to give up their land to pay debts owed to the World Bank. Capitalists have used that division to their advantage. Federici says that in Africa, quote, "The debt crisis of the 1970s and 80s has provided national and international capital with a golden opportunity to implement a wide-ranging restructuring of class relations aimed to cheapen the cost of labor, raise social productivity, reverse social expectations, and open the continent to a full penetration of capitalist relations, having the capitalist use of land as its basis."
Big at Bill Gates and Microsoft.
Federici also discusses the so-called commoning of rainforests by these institutions, declaring, quote, "Under the guise of protecting biodiversity and conserving the global commons, the bank has turned rainforests into ecological reserves and expelled the populations that for centuries had drawn their sustenance from them, while ensuring access to those who can pay, for instance, through ecotourism." So clearly people are getting removed from their land, oftentimes violently. And just as with the enclosures in medieval Europe, people who aren't cis men are the biggest losers. Federici explains, quote, "In Mozambique in recent years, women who have demanded their deceased husband's land or their share of the crops have been accused of being witches or of having murdered their husbands to inherit their belongings." Later, she explicitly states, quote, "Land disputes and land expropriations are also at the root of the witch hunts that have taken place in Africa in the 1980s and 1990s, in conjunction with the adjustment of African economies." Taking all that into account makes Markham-Cantor's first argument of, "it's a privilege to be a witch and not die," seem all the more disingenuous, doesn't it? Because this is just more evidence to show that sentencing people to death for witchcraft is merely a guise, and that our conception of the image of the witch has absolutely no bearing on the new witch hunts. It's not in how victims dress or whether they practice magic and healing arts. It's because our global capitalist system demands unlimited resources and cheap labor to exploit. and it's so much easier to take advantage of people who feel alienated from the loss of community cohesion. I think the real argument that Markham-Cantor was trying to make with this article is that the witch has been commodified by capitalism, and that is a net negative to our society. She writes that the witch is, quote, one of the most popular costumes in a Halloween industry on which Americans are projected to spend $8.8 billion this year alone. And yeah, I would agree that points to a larger issue about how big businesses have commodified Halloween, and Christmas, and Valentine's Day, etc., in order to turn huge profits and give all us plebes a never-ending list of reasons to buy more stuff. Markets don't care about your feelings, and they certainly don't care about the history that has formed our conception of the witch, much less about marginalized people today. Corporations just want your money, bruh, and whatever they can hijack and make profitable, they will. Federici actually touches on this in Caliban. She posits, the revival of magical beliefs is possible today because it no longer represents a social threat. The mechanization of the body is so constitutive of the individual that, at least in industrialized countries, giving space to the belief in occult forces does not jeopardize the regularity of social behavior. Astrology, too, can be allowed to return, with the certainty that even the most devoted consumer of astral charts will automatically consult the watch before going to work. Okay, so first of all, that's a huge bummer. But second, she's right. I mean, y'all remember that starter witch kit Sephora tried to sell? And other big-name stores like Urban Outfitters have hopped on the trend by selling tarot cards. You can get those at Barnes & Noble too, incidentally, and they're such a pain to shelf. But that's neither here nor there. My point, and Federici's point, and ultimately I think Markham-Cantor's point, even though her framework doesn't overtly make it, is that companies have noticed a new demographic to market to and make money from. Witchy stuff is cool, and the collective interest in witchcraft is pretty high right now. Like, people want an alternative to their repetitive and alienated lives as dictated by their low-wage jobs and the ever-growing cost of existing. Personally speaking, I just want to grow a shit ton of herbs and flowers and vegetables and mushrooms and just, give them to people while I frolic like a forest witch. But we're all trapped in this capitalist hegemony, and the corporate ghouls that run this country and own our labor know that right now, we're powerless to do anything about it. Because we all still have to show up to work tomorrow if we hope to even have food or a place to sleep. So companies spoon-feed us this regurgitated image of witchcraft and the witch, and we consume it as a form of self-care. And not like the real act of caring for our bodies and our spirits, but in the retail therapy kind of way. And that's totally antithetical to the purpose of witchcraft. So no, none of this is about the archetype of the witch. It's about capitalism, surprise! The plight of the witch, if you want to call it that, has been inherently anti-capitalist since the European witch hunts. It has been defined by brave women and non-traditional folks whose only real option is to resist the enclosure of their land and fight to maintain their autonomy, because otherwise they risk poverty, exploitation, and death. And Markham-Cantor can pay small lip service to all these issues, like most liberals do, but I don't think she's far enough left to, synthesize them with the issues of the explicitly capitalist commodification of the witch. But she is right when she says, quote, there is a rebellious power in the idea of being a witch, but it is not a cosmetic rebellion. It is a political act that requires interrogation of the past, active struggle in the present, and the refusal to scapegoat others. So yeah, let's keep interrogating the history and the imagery surrounding witches. And let's keep up with the struggles of people in colonized countries, and honestly, industrialized countries, who are dealing with the same issues of the maintenance of capitalism as the workers in early modern Europe were. But simply abstaining from dressing like a witch on Halloween is not enough. Our analysis has to go deeper than that. Thanks for watching and listening, y'all. It took me a lot longer than I wanted to get this video out because of holiday madness. But going forward, I hope to release new material either weekly or bi-weekly, depending on what subject I'm covering. So be on the lookout. And if you're into Twitter, go follow me at snarknotes_vids. Happy New Year's! And God help us through 2020.